Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. We are continuing in The Will to Power, and we are on point 3, or section 3, entitled General Observations Concerning Morality, and under this we have already made progress to Aphorism 288. And with that said, I'll get started. Morality regarded as an attempt at establishing human pride. The quote-unquote free will theory is anti-religious. Its ultimate object is to bestow the right upon man to regard himself as the cause of his highest state and actions. It is a form of the growing feeling of pride. Man feels his power, his quote-unquote happiness. As they say, there must be a will behind these states, otherwise they do not belong to him. Virtue is an attempt at postulating a modicum of will, past or present, as the necessary antecedent to every exalted and strong feeling of happiness. If the will to certain actions is regularly present in consciousness, a sensation of power may be interpreted as its result. This is a merely psychological point of view, based upon the false assumption that nothing belongs to us which we have not consciously willed. The whole of the teaching of responsibility relies upon the ingenuous psychological rule that the will is the only cause, and that one must have been aware of having willed in order to be able to regard oneself as a cause. Then comes the counter-movement, that of the moral philosophers. These men still labor under the delusion that a man is responsible only for what he has willed. The value of man is then made a moral value. Thus morality becomes a causa prima. For this there must be some kind of principle in man, and free will is posited as prima causa. The idea behind it is always this. If man is not a causa prima through his will, he must be irresponsible. Therefore, he does not come within the jurisdiction of morals. Virtue or vice is automatic and mechanical. In short, in order that man may respect himself, he must be capable of becoming evil. 289. Theatricalness regarded as the result of free will morality. It is a step in the development of the feeling of power itself to believe oneself to be the author of one's exalted moments, of one's perfection, and to have willed them. Criticism. All perfect action is precisely unconscious and not deliberate. Consciousness is often the expression of an imperfect and often morbid constitution. Personal perfection regarded as determined by will, as an act of consciousness, as reason with dialectics, is a caricature, a sort of self-contradiction. Any degree of consciousness renders perfection impossible, a form of theatricalness. 290. The moral hypothesis, designed with the view to justifying God, said, evil must be voluntary, simply in order that the voluntariness of goodness might be believed in. And again, all evil and suffering have an object which is salvation. The notion guilt was considered as something which had no connection at all with the ultimate cause of existence, and the notion punishment was held to be an educating and beneficent act, consequently an act proceeding from a good God. The absolute dominion of moral valuations over all others. Nobody doubted that God could not be evil and could do no harm. That is to say, perfection was understood merely as moral perfection. 291. How false is the supposition that an action must depend upon what has preceded it in consciousness, and morality has been measured in the light of this supposition, as also criminality. The value of an action must be judged by its results, say the utilitarians. To measure it according to its origin involves the impossibility of knowing that origin. But do we know its results? 5 stages ahead, perhaps. Who can tell what an action provokes and sets in motion? As a stimulus? As the spark which fires a powder magazine? Utilitarians are simpletons. And finally, they would first of all have to know what is useful. Here also their sight cannot travel on for over 5 stages or so. They have no notion of the great economy which cannot dispense with evil. We do not know the origin or the results. Has an action then any value? We have yet the action itself to consider. The states of consciousness that accompany it, the yea or nay which follows upon its performance. Does the value of an action lie in the subjective states which accompany it? In that case, the value of music would be measured according to the pleasure or displeasure which it occasions in us, which it gives to the composer. Obviously, feelings of value must accompany it, a sensation of power, restraint, or impotence, for instance, freedom or lightsomeness. Or, putting the question differently, could the value of an action be reduced to physiological terms? Could it be the expression of completely free or constrained life? Maybe its biological value is expressed in this way. If, then, an action can be judged neither in the light of its origin, nor its results, nor its accompaniments in consciousness, then its value must be X unknown. 292. It amounts to a denaturalization of morality to separate an action from a man, to direct hatred or contempt against quote-unquote sin, to believe that there are actions which are good or bad in themselves. The re-establishment of quote-unquote nature, an action in itself is quite devoid of value. The whole question is this: who performed it? One and the same crime may in one case be the greatest privilege, in the other infamy. As a matter of fact, it is the selfishness of the judges which interprets an action, in regard to its author, according as to whether it was useful or harmful to themselves, or in relation to its degree of likeness or unlikeness to them. 293. The concept reprehensible action presents us with some difficulties. Nothing in all that happens can be reprehensible in itself. One would not dare to eliminate it completely, for everything is so bound up with everything else that to exclude one part would mean to exclude the whole. A reprehensible action, therefore, would mean a reprehensible world as a whole. And even then, in a reprehensible world, even reprehending would be reprehensible, and the consequence of an attitude of mind that condemns everything would be the affirmation of everything in practice. If becoming is a huge ring, everything that forms a part of it is of equal value, is eternal and necessary. In all correlations of yea and nay, of preference and rejection, love and hate, all that is expressed is a certain point of view, peculiar to the interest of a certain type of living organism. Everything that lives says yea by the very fact of its existence. 294. Criticism of the subjective feelings of value. Conscience. Formerly people argued, conscience condemns this action, therefore this action is reprehensible. But as a matter of fact, conscience condemns an action because that action has been condemned for a long period of time. All conscience does is to imitate. It does not create values. That which first led to the condemnation of certain actions was not conscience, but the knowledge of, or the prejudice against, its consequences. The approbation of conscience, the feeling of well-being, of inner peace, is of the same order of emotions as the artist's joy over his work. It proves nothing. Self-contentment proves no more in favor of that which gives rise to it than its absence can prove anything against the value of the thing which fails to give rise to it. We are far too ignorant to be able to judge of the value of our actions. In this respect, we lack the ability to regard things objectively. Even when we condemn an action, we do not do so as judges, but as adversaries. When noble sentiments accompany an action, they prove nothing in its favor. An artist may present us with an absolutely insignificant thing, though he be in the throes of the most exalted pathos during its production. It were wiser to regard these sentiments as misleading. They actually beguile our eye and our power away from criticism, from caution, and from suspicion, and the result often is that we make fools of ourselves. they actually make fools of us. 295. We are heirs to the conscience vivisection and self-crucifixion of 2,000 years. In these two practices lie perhaps our longest efforts at becoming perfect, our mastery, and certainly our subtlety. We have affiliated natural propensities with a heavy conscience. An attempt to produce an entirely opposite state of affairs would be possible. That is to say, to affiliate all desires of a beyond, all sympathy with things which are opposed to the senses, the intellect, and nature, in fact all the ideals that have existed hitherto, which were all anti-worldly, with a heavy conscience. 296. The great crimes in psychology. 1. That all pain and unhappiness should have been falsified by being associated with what is wrong, guilt. Thus pain was robbed of its innocence. 2. That all strong emotions, wantonness, voluptuousness, triumph, pride, audacity, knowledge, assurance, and happiness in itself, were branded as sinful, as seductive, and as suspicious. 3. That feelings of weakness, inner acts of cowardice, lack of personal courage, should have decked themselves in the most beautiful words, and have been taught as desirable in the highest degree. 4. That greatness in man should have been given the meaning of disinterestedness, self-sacrifice for another's good, for other people. That even in the scientist and the artist, the elimination of the individual personality is presented as the cause of the greatest knowledge and ability. 5. That love should have been twisted round to mean submission and altruism, whereas it is in reality an act of approbation or a bestowal, resulting in the last case from a superabundance in the wealth of a given personality. Only the wholest people can love. The disinterested ones, the objective ones, are the worst lovers. Just ask the girls. This principle also applies to the love of God or of the home country. A man must be able to rely absolutely upon himself. Egotism may be regarded as the preeminence of the ego, altruism as the preeminence of others. 6. Life regarded as a punishment, happiness as a means of seduction. The passions regarded as devilish, confidence in oneself as godless. The whole of psychology is a psychology of obstacles, a sort of barricade built out of fear. On the one hand, we find the masses, the botched and bungled, the mediocre, defending themselves, by means of it, against the strong, and finally destroying them in their growth. On the other hand, we find all the instincts with which these classes are best able to prosper, sanctified and alone held in honor by them. Let anyone examine the Jewish priesthood. 297. The vestiges of the depreciation of nature through the moral transcendence. The value of disinterestedness, the cult of altruism, the belief in a reward in the play of natural consequences, the belief in goodness and in genius itself, as if the one, like the other, were the result of disinterestedness, the continuation of the Church's sanction of the life of the citizen, the absolutely deliberate misunderstanding of history as a means of educating up to morality, or pessimism in the attitude taken up towards history. The latter is just as much a result of the depreciation of nature as is that pseudo-justification of history, that refusal to see history as the pessimist sees it. 298. Quote, morality for its own sake, end quote. This is an important step in the denaturalization of morals. In itself, it appears as a final value. In this phase, religion has generally become saturated with it, as for instance in the case of Judaism. It likewise goes through a phase in which it separates itself from religion, and in which no God is moral enough for it. It then prefers the impersonal ideal. This is how the case stands at present. Quote, art for art's sake, end quote. This is a likewise dangerous principle. By this means a false contrast is lent to things. It culminates in the slander of reality, idealizing into the hateful. When an ideal is severed from reality, the latter is debased, impoverished, and calumniated. Beauty for beauty's sake, truth for truth's sake, goodness for goodness' sake, these are three forms of the evil eye for reality. Art, knowledge, and morality are means. Instead of recognizing a life-promoting tendency in them, they have been associated with the opposite of life, with God. They have also been regarded as revelations of a higher world, which here and there transpires through them. Quote-unquote beautiful and ugly, true and false, good and evil. These things are distinctions and antagonisms which betray the preservative and promotive measures of life, not necessarily of man alone, but of all stable and enduring organisms which take up a definite stand against their opponents. The war which thus ensues is the essential factor. It is a means of separating things, leading to stronger isolation. 299. Moral naturalism. The tracing back of apparently independent and supernatural values to their real quote-unquote nature, that is to say, to natural immorality, to natural utility, etc. Perhaps I may designate the tendency of these observations by the term moral naturalism. My object is to retranslate the moral values which have apparently become independent and unnatural into their real nature, that is to say, into their natural immorality. In B refers to Jewish holiness and its natural basis. The case is the same in regard to the moral law which has been made sovereign, emancipated from its real feature, until it is almost the opposite of nature. The stages in the denaturalization of morality, or so-called idealization. First, it is a road to individual happiness. Then it is the result of knowledge. Then it is a categorical imperative. Then it is a way to salvation. Then it is a denial of the will to live. The gradual progress of the hostility of morality to life. 300. The suppressed and effaced heresy in morality. Concepts. Paganism, master morality, virtue. 301. My problem. What harm has mankind suffered hitherto from morals, as also from its own morality, intellectual harm, etc.? 302. Why are not human values once more deposited nicely in the rut into which they alone have a right, as routinary values? Many species of animals have already become extinct. Supposing man were also to disappear, nothing would be lacking on earth. A man should be enough of a philosopher to admire even this nothing, nil admirari. 303. Man, a small species of very excitable animals, which, fortunately, has its time. Life in general on earth is a matter of a moment, an incident, an exception that has no consequence, something which is of no importance whatever to the general character of the earth. The earth itself is, like every star, a hiatus between two nonentities, an event without a plan, without reason, will, or self-consciousness, the worst kind of necessity, foolish necessity. Something in us rebels against this view. The serpent vanity whispers to our hearts, quote, all this must be false because it is revolting. Could not all this be appearance? And man, in spite of all, to use Kant's words, end quote, dash. Section 4. How virtue is made to dominate. 304. Concerning the ideal of the moralist. In this treatise we wish to speak of the great politics of virtue. We wrote it for the use of all those who are interested, not so much in the process of becoming virtuous as in that of making others virtuous, and how virtue is made to dominate. I even intend to prove that in order to desire this one thing, the dominion of virtue, the other must be systematically avoided. That is to say, one must renounce all hopes of becoming virtuous. This sacrifice is great, but such an end is perhaps a sufficient reward for such a sacrifice, and even greater sacrifices. and some of the most famous moralists have risked as much. For these, indeed, had already recognized and anticipated the truth which is to be revealed for the first time in this treatise, that the dominion of virtue is absolutely attainable only by the use of the same means which are employed in the attainment of any other dominion, in any case, not by means of virtue itself. As I have already said, this treatise deals with the politics of virtue. It postulates an ideal of these politics. It describes it as it ought to be, if anything at all can be perfect on this earth. Now, no philosopher can be in any doubt as to what the type of perfection is in politics. It is, of course, Machiavellianism. But Machiavellianism, which is pure without admixture, crude, fresh with all its force, with all its pungency, is superhuman, divine, transcendental, and can never be achieved by man. The most he can do is to approximate it. Even in this narrower kind of politics, in the politics of virtue, the ideal never seems to have been realized. Plato, too, only bordered upon it. Granted that one have eyes for concealed things, one can discover, even in the most guileless and most conscious moralists, and this is indeed the name of these moral politicians, and of the founders of all new moral forces, traces showing that they too pay their tribute to human weakness. They all aspire to virtue on their own account, at least in their moments of weariness, and this is the leading and most capital error on the part of any moralist, whose duty it is to be an immoralist in deeds. That he must not exactly appear to be the latter is another matter. Or rather, it is not another matter. Systematic self-denial of this kind, or expressed morally, dissimulation, belongs to and is part and parcel of the moralist's canon and of his self-imposed duties. Without it, he can never attain to his particular kind of perfection. Freedom from morality and from truth, when enjoyed for that purpose, which rewards every sacrifice, for the sake of making morality dominate, that is the canon. Moralists are in need of the attitudes of virtue, as also of the attitudes of truth. Their errors begin when they yield to virtue, when they lose control of virtue, when they themselves become moral or true. A great moralist is, among other things, necessarily a great actor. His only danger is that his pose may unconsciously become a second nature, just like his ideal, which is to keep his being and his operating apart in a divine way. Everything he does must be done sub specie boni, a lofty, remote, and exacting ideal, a divine ideal, and as a matter of fact, they say that the moralist thus imitates a model which is no less than God himself. God, the greatest immoralist in deeds that exists, but who nevertheless understands how to remain what he is, the good God. 305. The dominion of virtue is not established by means of virtue itself. With virtue itself, one renounces power, one loses the will to power. 306. The victory of a moral ideal is achieved by the same immoral means as any other victory: violence, lies, slander, injustice. 307. He who knows the way fame originates will be suspicious even of the fame virtue enjoys. 308. Morality is just as immoral as any other thing on earth. Morality is in itself a form of immorality. The great relief which this conviction brings, the contradiction between things disappears, the unity of all phenomena is saved. 309. There are some who actually go in search of what is immoral. When they say, "This is wrong," they believe it ought to be done away with or altered. On the other hand, I do not rest until I am quite clear concerning the immorality of any particular thing which happens to come under my notice. When I discover it, I recover my equanimity. 310. A. The ways which lead to power. The presentation of the new virtue under the name of an old one. The awakening of interest concerning it. quote-unquote happiness declared to be its reward, and vice versa, artistic slandering of all that stands in its way, the exploitation of advantages and accidents with the view of glorifying it, the conversion of its adherents into fanatics by means of sacrifices and separations, symbolism on a grand scale. B. Power attained. 1. Means of constraint of virtue. 2. Seductive means of virtue. 3. The court etiquette of virtue. 311. By what means does a virtue attain to power? With precisely the same means as a political party: slander, suspicion, the undermining of opposing virtues that happen to be already in power, the changing of their names, systematic persecution and scorn, in short, by means of acts of general immorality. How does a desire behave towards itself in order to become a virtue? A process of rechristening, systematic denial of its intentions, practice in misunderstanding itself, alliance with established and recognized virtues, ostentatious enmity towards its adversaries. If possible, too, the protection of sacred powers must be purchased. People must also be intoxicated and fired with enthusiasm. Idealistic humbug must be used, and a party must be won, which either triumphs or perishes. One must be unconscious and naive. 312. Cruelty has become transformed and elevated into tragic pity, so that we no longer recognize it as such. The same has happened to the love of the sexes, which has become amour passion. The slavish attitude of mind appears as Christian obedience. Wretchedness becomes humility. The disease of the nervus sympathicus, for instance, is eulogized as pessimism, Pascalism, or Carlylism, etc. 313. We should begin to entertain doubts concerning a man if we heard that he required reasons in order to remain respectable. We should, in any case, certainly avoid his society. The little word "for" in certain cases may be compromising. Sometimes a single "for" is enough to refute one. If we should hear in course of time that such and such an aspirant for virtue was in need of bad reasons in order to remain respectable, it would not conduce to increasing our respect for him. But he goes further. He comes to us and tells us quite openly, "You disturb my morality with your disbelief, Mr. Skeptic. So long as you cannot believe in my bad reasons, that is to say, in my God, in a disciplinary beyond, in free will, etc., you put obstacles in the way of my virtue. Moral skeptics must be suppressed. They prevent the moralization of the masses." 314. Our most sacred convictions, those which are permanent in us, concerning the highest values, are judgments emanating from our muscles. 315. Morality and the valuation of races and classes. In view of the fact that the passions and fundamental instincts in every race and class express the means which enable the latter to preserve themselves, or at least the means which have enabled them to live for the longest period of time, to call them quote-unquote virtuous practically means that they change their character, shed their skins, and blot out their past. It means that they should cease from differentiating themselves from others. It means that they are getting to resemble each other in their needs and aspirations, or more exactly, that they are declining. It means that the will to one kind of morality is merely the tyranny of the particular species, which is adapted to that kind of morality, over the other species. It means a process of annihilation or general leveling in favor of the prevailing species, whether it be to render the non-prevailing species harmless or to exploit them. The abolition of slavery, a so-called tribute to human dignity, in truth the annihilation of a fundamentally different species, the undermining of its values and its happiness. The qualities which constitute the strength of an opposing race or class are declared to be the most evil and pernicious things it has, for by means of them it may be harmful to us. Its virtues are slandered and rechristened. When a man or a people harm us, their action constitutes an objection against them. But from their point of view, we are desirable, because we are such as can be useful to them. The insistence upon spreading humanness, which guilelessly starts out with the assumption that it is in possession of the formula, "what is human," is all humbug, beneath the cover of which a certain definite type of man strives to attain power. Or, more precisely, a very particular kind of instinct, the gregarious instinct. The equality of men. This is what lies concealed behind the tendency of making ever more and more men alike as men. The interested nature of the morality of ordinary people. The trick was to elevate the great passions for power and property to the positions of protectors of virtue. To what extent do all kinds of businessmen and money-grabbers, all those who give and take credit, find it necessary to promote the leveling of all characters and notions of value? The commerce and the exchange of the world leads to, and almost purchases, virtue. The state exercises the same influence, as does any sort of ruling power at the head of officials and soldiers. Science acts in the same way, in order that it may work in security and economize its forces, and the priesthood does the same. Communal morality is thus promoted here, because it is advantageous, and in order to make it triumph, war and violence are waged against immorality. With what right? Without any right whatsoever, but in accordance with the instinct of self-preservation. The same classes avail themselves of immorality when it serves their purpose to do so. 316. Observe the hypocritical color which all civil institutions are painted, just as if they were the offshoots of morality. For instance, marriage, work, calling, patriotism, the family, order, and rights. But as they were all established in favor of the most mediocre type of man, to protect him from exceptions and the need of exceptions, one must not be surprised to find them sown with lies. 317. Virtue must be defended against its preachers. They are its worst enemies, for they teach virtue as an ideal for all. They divest virtue of the charm which consists in its rareness, its inimitableness, its exceptional and non-average character, that is to say, of its aristocratic charm. A stand must also be made against those embittered idealists who eagerly tap all pots and are satisfied to hear them ring hollow. What ingenuousness, to demand great and rare things, and then to declare with anger and contempt of one's fellows that they do not exist. It is obvious, for instance, that a marriage is worth only as much as those are worth whom it joins. That is to say, that on the whole it is something wretched and indecent. No priest or registrar can make anything else of it. Virtue has all the instincts of the average man against it. It is not profitable, it is not prudent, and it isolates. It is related to passion, and not very accessible to reason. It spoils the character, the head, and the senses, always, of course, subject to the medium standard of men. It provokes hostility towards order, and towards the lies which are concealed beneath all order, all institutions, and all reality. When seen in the light of its pernicious influence upon others, it is the worst of vices. I recognize virtue in that, 1. It does not insist upon being recognized. 2. It does not presuppose the existence of virtue everywhere, but precisely something else. 3. It does not suffer from the absence of virtue, but regards it rather as a relation of perspective which throws virtue into relief. It does not proclaim itself. 4. It makes no propaganda. 5. It allows no one to pose as judge because it is always a personal virtue. 6. It does precisely what is generally forbidden. Virtue, as I understand it, is the actual vetitum within all gregarious legislation. 7. In short, I recognize virtue in that it is in the Renaissance style, virtu, free from all moralic acid. 318. In the first place, gentlemen, virtue-mongers, you have no superiority over us. we should like to make you take modesty a little more to heart. It is wretched personal interest and prudence which suggest your virtue to you. And if you had more strength and courage in your bodies, you would not lower yourselves thus to the level of virtuous nonentities. You make that you can say of yourselves, partly what you are obliged to make, that is to say, what your circumstances force you to make, partly what suits your pleasure and seems useful to you. But if you do only what is in keeping with your inclinations, or what necessity exacts from you, or what is useful to you, you ought neither to praise yourselves nor let others praise you. One is a thoroughly puny kind of man when one is only virtuous. Nothing should mislead you in this regard. Men who have to be considered at all were never such donkeys of virtue. Their inmost instinct, that which determined their quantum of power, did not find its reckoning thus. Whereas with your minimum amount of power, nothing can seem more full of wisdom to you than virtue. But the multitude are on your side, and because you tyrannize over us, we shall fight you. 319. A virtuous man is of a lower species, because, in the first place, he has no quote-unquote personality, but acquires his value by conforming with a certain human scheme which has been once and forever fixed. He has no independent value. He may be compared. He has his equals. He must not be an individual. Reckoning up the qualities of the good man, why is it that they appear pleasant to us? Because they urge us neither to war, to mistrust, to caution, to the accumulating of forces, nor to severity. Our laziness, our good nature, and our levity have a good time. This, our feeling of well-being, is what we project into the good man in the form of a quality, in the form of a valuable possession. 320. Under certain circumstances, virtue is merely a venerable form of stupidity. Who could blame you for it? And this form of virtue has not been outlived even today. A sort of honest peasant simplicity, which is possible, however, in all classes of society, and which one cannot meet with anything else than a respectful smile, still thinks today that everything is in good hands, that is to say, in God's hands. And when it supports this proposition with that same modest assurance as that with which it would assert that 2 and 2 are 4, we others naturally refrain from contradiction. Why disturb this pure foolery? Why darken it with our cares concerning man, people, goals, the future? Even if we wished to do so, we shouldn't succeed. In all things these people see the reflection of their own venerable stupidity and goodness. In them the old god, Deus Myops, still lives. We others see something else in everything. Our problematic nature, our contradictions, our deeper, more painful, and more suspicious wisdom. 321. He who finds a particular virtue an easy matter ultimately laughs at it. Seriousness cannot be maintained once virtue is attained. As soon as a man has reached virtue, he jumps out of it. Whither? Into devilry. Meanwhile, how intelligent all our evil tendencies and impulses have become. What an amount of inquisitiveness torments them. They are all fishhooks of knowledge. 322. The idea is to associate vice with something so terrible that at last one is obliged to run away from it in order to be rid of its associations. This is the well-known case of Tannhäuser. Tannhäuser, brought to his wit's end by Wagnerian music, cannot endure life any longer even in the company of Mrs. Venus. Suddenly virtue begins to have a charm for him. A Thuringian virgin goes up in price, and what is even worse still, he shows a liking for Wolfram von Eschenbach's melody. 323. The patrons of virtue. Lust of property, lust of power, laziness, simplicity, fear. All these things are interested in virtue. That is why it stands so securely. 324. Virtue is no longer believed in. Its powers of attraction are dead. What is needed is someone who will once more bring it into the market in the form of an outlandish kind of adventure and of dissipation. It exacts too much extravagance and narrow-mindedness from its believers to allow its conscience not being against it today. Certainly for people without either consciences or scruples, this may constitute its new charm. It is now what it has never been before, a vice. 325. Virtue is still the most expensive vice. Let it remain so. 326. Virtues are as dangerous as vices, insofar as they are allowed to rule over one as authorities and laws coming from outside, and not as qualities one develops oneself. The latter is the only right way. They should be the most personal means of defense and most individual needs. The determining factors of precisely our existence and growth, which we recognize and acknowledge independently of the question whether others grow with us with the help of the same or of different principles. This view of the danger of the virtue which is understood as impersonal and objective also holds good of modesty. Through modesty, many of the choicest intellects perish. The morality of modesty is the worst possible softening influence for those souls for which it is preeminently necessary that they become hard betimes. 327. The domain of morality must be reduced and limited step by step. The names of the instincts which are really active in this sphere must be drawn into the light of day and honored, after have lain all this time in the concealment of hypocritical names of virtue. Out of respect for one's quote-unquote honesty, which makes itself heard ever more and more imperiously, one ought to unlearn the shame which makes one deny and explain away all natural instincts. The extent to which one can dispense with virtue is the measure of one's strength, and a height may be imagined where the notion virtue is understood in such a way as to be reminiscent of virtu, the virtue of the Renaissance, free from the moralic acid. But for the moment, how remote this ideal seems. The reduction of the domain of morality is a sign of its progress. Wherever hitherto thought has not been guided by causality, thinking has taken a moral turn. 328. After all, what have I achieved? Let us not close our eyes to this wonderful result. I have lent new charms to virtue. It now affects one in the same way as something forbidden. It has our most subtle honesty against it. It is salted in the cum grano salis of the scientific pang of conscience. It savors of antiquity and of old fashion, and thus it is at last beginning to draw refined people and to make them inquisitive. In short, it affects us like a vice. Only after we have once recognized that everything consists of lies and appearance shall we have again earned the right to uphold this most beautiful of all fictions, virtue. There will then remain no further reason to deprive ourselves of it. Only when we have shown virtue to be a form of immorality do we again justify it. It then becomes classified and likened in its fundamental features to the profound and general immorality of all existence, of which it is then shown to be a part. It appears as a form of luxury of the first order, the most arrogant, the dearest, and the rarest form of vice. We have robbed it of its grimaces and divested it of its drapery. We have delivered it of the importunate familiarity of the crowd. We have deprived it of its ridiculous rigidity, its empty expression, its stiff, false hair, and its hieratic muscles. 329. And is it supposed that I have thereby done any harm to virtue? Just as little as anarchists do to princes. Only since they have been shot at have they once more sat securely on their thrones. For thus it has always been and will ever be. One cannot do a thing a better service than to persecute it and to run it to earth. This I have done. This is the end of Part 8 of The Will to Power by Friedrich Nietzsche. Thank you for listening.